All right, so in this last section here, we're going to talk about the riots and rebellions and revolts that took place in the English colonies during this time frame. These, in a lot of ways, shaped some of the colonial viewpoints that kind of end up leading up into the American Revolution about 100 years later. But a lot of those things really started here in the mid 1600s with some of these rebellions. So the 1600s, saw a lot of the establishment and solidification of the British North American colonies, but it certainly did not occur peacefully on all fronts. The English settlements on the continent were very much rocked by explosions of violence, including the Pequot War, the Mystic Massacre, King Philip's War, the Susquehannock War, Bacon's Rebellion, the Pueblo Revolt, okay? And so definitely major instances of times where the English really had to fight, and it really created this idea of, we fought for this, it's ours, it's our right mentality. So the first one that we're going to talk about, the Pequot War, it's Pequot, Pequot War. It's May 1637. You have this armed contingent of English Puritans that come from Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth and Connecticut, and they trek into the native country and the territory claimed by New England. They refer to themselves as the Sword of the Lord, and this military force is really intended to attack the insolent and barbarous nation called the Pequots. And in the resulting violence, the Puritans basically set upon the Mystic community. And the Mystic community, it's on the Mystic River or whatever, they basically torch it. And they begin on the north and south ends of the town. As Pequot men, women, children, they try to escape the blaze. Soldiers are waiting with guns and swords. And one commander estimated that of the 400 souls in this fort, not above 5 of them escaped without our hands, or escaped out of our hands. Another counted nearly 600 or 700 dead. Nonetheless, in a span of about 2 months, the English Puritans boasted that the Pequot were driven out of their country, slain by the sword, to the number of 1,500, which is just nuts. The foundations of this war really lay within the rivalry between the Pequot and the Narragansett and the Mohican Narragansett, who battled for control of the fur and wampum trades in this northeast region. The rivalry eventually forced the English and the Dutch to choose sides, and so the war remained a conflict of native interests and initiative, especially the Mohican, who had basically tried to play both sides of the fence. And so they end up coming in after the Pequot get destroyed. They're able to reap the rewards of that and take over some of that land. They kind of come out on top in this region, at least for the moment. Victory of the Pequot not only provided security and stability for the English colonies, but it also propelled the Mohican to new heights of political and economic influence as basically the primary power in New England. Ironically, history seemingly repeats itself later in the century as the Mohican, who are desperate for a remedy to their diminishing strength, joined the Wampanoag War against the Puritans, right? So they'll fight with anybody. They don't care. This produces an even more violent conflict in 1675 known as King Philip's War, and which actually ends up bringing a decisive end to native power in New England. So in the winter of 1675, the body of a man named John Sassman, who is a Christian, Harvard-educated Wampanoag, is found under the ice of a pond near Harvard. A fellow Christian native informs the English authority that there's 3 warriors under the local sachem or the local chief named Metacom, which the English called King Philip. So the chief's name was Metacom. They call him King Philip. And they say these three guys that worked for this chief killed Sassman, who had basically previously accused Metacom of planning an offensive against the English. So the three killers, they appear before a Plymouth court. They're found guilty and executed. So a couple weeks goes by, and a group of Wampanoags basically saying, hey, we're going to level the score, kill 9 English colonists in the town of Swansea. Now, this is a problem. Now, Metacom, like most other New England chiefs, had entered into a covenant of submission to various colonies, basically viewing the arrangement as, relationships of protection and reciprocity rather than, subjugation. And so the natives and the English, they lived and traded and worshiped and, they arbitrated disputes in close proximity, but the execution of the 3 of Metacom's men by the Plymouth colony epitomized what many natives viewed as the growing inequality of that relationship. So the Wampanoags who attacked Swansea, they may have, tried to, as I said, be restoring the balance or retaliating, but they didn't quite understand what was going to happen because of that, because basically all of New England gets engulfed in war. Authorities in Plymouth basically spring into action. They enlist help from the neighboring colonies of Connecticut, Massachusetts. Metacom and his followers kind of elude the colonial forces throughout the summer, striking more Plymouth towns as they move northwest. Some other native groups join his forces. Some remain neutral and support the English, but it really divides the native communities. Metacom himself had very little control over the events that end up happening because of these alliances. Panic, violence, they spread throughout New England in the fall of in 1675. The English don't even trust the neutral natives. And so they would, say, hey, surrender your weapons, and even the ones that were trying to help them. And this pushed a lot of them into open war. By the end of 1675, most of the natives in present-day western and central Massachusetts had entered the war, laid waste to nearby English towns like Deerfield and Hadley and Brookfield. The colonial forces, they're kind of spurning the military assistance of other natives, such as the Mohicans. They're unable to locate the native communities that are attacking them. They're not able to intercept the attacks. And so the English are compounding their problems. They just attack powerful Indian tribes. They attack everybody. The biggest mistake, one of the biggest mistakes they made was they, attacked the Narragansett of Rhode Island. And this was called the Great Swamp Fight. And you have about 1,000 Englishmen put the Narragansett village to the torch. They gunned down about 1,000 of them. And the Narragansett, the ones that survived, they joined the other side now. They were supportive of the English, and then the English just crush them. And so the English, in their attempt to crush these native groups, ends up uniting a lot of them. And they get closer and closer to Boston. But by the spring of 1676, the tide kind of turns. The New English colonies take the advice of men like Benjamin Church. They say, hey, you need to use the native allies, the Pequot, the Mohican. You need to use them to find these mobile warriors. They start to burn down croplands, and with the natives not able to plant crops, they're forced to live off the land. Obviously, this is going to, make them less strong. The growing number of fighters who fled the region or switched sides or surrendered grew. The English sold many of the group into slavery that they captured. The colonial forces finally catch up with Metacom, and they slay the great Indian chief in August of 1676. Now, this war permanently alters the political and demographic landscape of New England. Between 800 and 1,000 English people died. At least 3,000 natives perished in this 14-month conflict. Thousands of other natives fled the region or get sold into slavery. In 1670, natives comprised about 25% of the population of New England. A decade later, they only made up about 10%. So the war's brutality definitely encouraged a growing hatred of all natives among the New England colonists. And although the fighting does cease, the bitter legacy of King Philip's War really did live on. You also have some internal strife, right? 16 years after this, New England faces this new fear of the supernatural, right? And you end up in early 1692 and 1693, Salem town, Salem village, Ipswich, Andover, they all end up trying men and women as witches. Paranoia is sweeping through the region. 14 women, 6 men are executed, 5 others die in prison. And the cause of these trials, they kind of spring up out of nowhere for some reason. Some of it had to do with local rivalries, political turmoil, but I think a lot of it probably had something to do with just the trauma of the war and the faulty legal system where you could accuse somebody as a method of self-defense, right? That you could say, hey, the only reason I did that is because that person is a witch and they bewitched me. And that was like a solid defense at the time. Like, they'd be like, oh, well, by all means, we'll let you go then. My bad. Let's go arrest them, which is weird. The tensions with the natives, though, really framed the event, and the Native and African people that were in that area, that their spiritualism kind of fed into this idea that there could be witchcraft going on. Native American communities in Virginia had really been decimated by the wars in 1622 and 1640 through 1644, but a new clash begins to rise the same year that New England crushes Metacom. And this conflict's known as Bacon's Rebellion. And it really kind of grows out of the tensions between Native Americans and English settlers, as well as the tensions between the wealthy English landowners and the poor settlers who continued to want to push west into native territory. So interestingly enough, Bacon's Rebellion started over a pig. In the summer of 1675, a group of Dogue Indians visited a guy named Thomas Matthew on his plantation to collect on a debt that he owed them. Matthew refused to pay, and so what they did was they took some of his pigs to settle the debt. This theft sparks a series of raids and counter-raids, and the Susquehannock Indians get caught in the crossfire when a group of militia mistake them for the Dogue, and they kill 14 of them. Well, obviously, the Susquehannock are going to retaliate, and they kill colonists in Virginia and Maryland. The England marshal their forces. They laid siege to Susquehannock. It kind of became uglier after the militia executed the delegation of Susquehannock ambassadors who had come to talk about a truce. These militiamen just execute them under the flag of truce. And, this launches even more raids, kill dozens of English colonists. And it triggers this political crisis in Virginia because as these colonists flee from the frontiers into coastal communities, they beg the government, help us against the natives. But the governor at the time is a guy named Sir William Berkeley. And he doesn't send an army after the Susquehannock. He worries that a full-scale war would drag other natives into the conflict. It would turn allies into enemies. Berkeley, therefore, insisted on a defensive strategy. He wanted to make a string of new fortifications to protect the frontier, and he gave strict instructions not to antagonize friendly natives. It was really sound military policy, but it was a public relation disaster because the terrified colonists really condemned Berkeley. Building contracts for the forts obviously went to his friends, who conveniently decided that their own plantations were the most strategically vital, and so that's where the fortifications went. Colonists denounced the governor as corrupt and just trying to line the pockets of their friends instead of protecting the people. So by the spring of 1676, a small group of frontier colonists take matters into their own hands. They name a young, charismatic man, Nathaniel Bacon, as their leader. They're self-styled volunteers, proclaim that they are taking up arms in defense of their homes and families, and they take pains to make sure that Berkeley understands, hey, we're not trying to be disloyal, but we have to protect ourselves. Well, Berkeley is like, well, I'm not going to get overthrown, so he calls them traitors. He does mobilize an army finally, but not to go after the natives, but to crush the colonists. And this drastic response obviously catapults this small band of anti-native vigilantes into basically full-fledged rebels. Bacon and the rebels stalk the Susquehannock, and as well as friendly natives like the Pamunkey and the Occaneechi. The rebels become convinced that there's a massive native conspiracy to destroy England, and Berkeley's stubborn persistence that you should defend friendly natives and all of this, it leads them to accuse him of basically conspiring with these natives to slaughter the English. So then you jump to the early summer of 76. Bacon's neighbors elect him their Burgess, and they send him to the House of Burgesses in Jamestown. And he goes there, and he convinces the House of Burgess to enact pro-rebel reforms, like prohibiting the sale of weapons to natives and restoring suffrage rights to landless freemen. But the supporters of Bacon are not satisfied. So Berkeley actually ends up arresting Bacon and forcing the rebel leader into this very humiliating position of having to beg forgiveness for treason. He does it, but then he turns the tables. And he has his followers surround the State House, demanding that Berkeley name him the General of Virginia and bless the universal war against the natives. But that's not what happens. The 70-year-old governor steps onto the field in front of the crowd and angry people. He's very unafraid. He calls Bacon a traitor to his face. He tears open his shirt. He dares Bacon to shoot him in the heart. If he's so intent on overthrowing the government, he tells him, here, shoot me here. It's a fair mark. And so Bacon doesn't do it. So Berkeley draws his sword, challenges him to a duel. Knowing that Bacon couldn't back down from the challenge without looking like a coward, but he also couldn't kill Berkeley without making himself look like a villain. So instead, Bacon basically resorts to just bluster. He threatens to slaughter the entire assembly if he has to. He says, damn my blood, I came here for commission, and commission I will have before I go. Berkeley's defiant, but the crowd, the Burgesses finally give in to what Bacon wants and give Virginia a general to lead this war against the natives. So after this really dramatic showdown in Jamestown, Bacon's rebellion spirals out of control. Berkeley rebuilds his army, forces Bacon to divert his attention to the coasts and away from the natives. Most of the rebels are more interested in defending their homes and families than fighting other Englishmen. So anytime that native activity gets going, they're just taking off. They don't want to fight against the other English, and so a lot of places the rebellion becomes more of a way to get your grievances out, because both rebels and loyalists see the opportunities for plunder. They seize rivals' estates, they confiscate property. There is a small minority of rebels who see this as an ideological revolution. Women like Sarah Drummond, who's the wife of a rebel leader, William Drummond, she advocates servants, black slaves. They fight side by side on both sides of the conflict because thinking, hey, well, I'll get free because of my service. Everyone accused everyone of treason. It just really tore Virginia apart. It was a time of anarchy for the people of Virginia. The rebels continuously lose ground. They ultimately suffer a crushing defeat when Bacon dies of typhus in 1676, and his successors basically end up surrendering to Berkeley the next January. Berkeley basically tries and executes the entire rebel leadership, and basically, eventually the royal coats, the redcoats, the royal troops show up with the order of, restore order to the colony. They get rid of Berkeley. They send him back to London. He dies in disgrace, and Bacon's rebellion is over. However, the results are kind of uncertain at best. The garrison of royal troops do discourage, further violence by both sides, but the tensions remain, right? You still have the elite planners that are exploiting labor. Average people are still kind of resentful of the government for allowing this exploitation. But one of the biggest things is that because people are being exploited for their labor, the government says, well, to make that easier, we'll just bring in more slaves. And so you have large-scale adoption of slave labor in the Chesapeake area due to Bacon's rebellion, ultimately. Spanish have their own problems. You have a few years after that in New Mexico, you have the Puebloan Revolt, led by a man named Pope, and you need to know Pope for quiz and test purposes. A few years before that, he had been arrested and whipped for sorcery, and then he goes on to lead various Pueblo groups in a rebellion against the Spanish. Several thousand Pueblo warriors kind of go and they raised the Spanish countryside. They lay siege to Santa Fe. They kill 400 people, including 21 Franciscan priests. They allowed another 2,000 Spaniards and Christian Puebloans to flee, but it was probably the greatest act of native resistance in North American history. In New Mexico, the Puebloans eradicate all traces of Spanish rule. They destroy churches. They throw them in the rivers to wash away their Christian baptisms. Pope exclaims that the God of the Christians is dead and that the Puebloans are going to go back and resume spiritual practices. And this lasts for 12 years until the Spanish are able to come back in 1692 and reconquer New Mexico. There's also a great deal of violence in the Carolinas. You have the Yamasee, who were the closest allies and most lucrative trade partners. They turn against the colony and nearly destroy it entirely. One settler, George Rodd, believed the Yamasees wanted nothing less than, quote, the whole continent and to kill us or chase us all out. The Yamasee would eventually advance within just miles of Charleston. And the first victims of that war were traders. The government had dispatched two of the colony's most prominent men to visit and pacify the Yamasee Council, following rumors of unrest. The Yamasee quickly proved that their fears were well-founded by killing the men and every English trader they could find. And so, like many other natives, they had come to depend on English courts as much as flintlock rifles and ammunition that traders had given them for slaves and animal skins. So feuds between the English agents in native territory had crippled the court of trade and shut down all diplomacy, provoking the violent Yamasee reprisal. So basically, the English had cut them out of the court and cut them off from being able to get anything from them because they wanted to take their land. Most of the Indian villages in the southeast sent a few warriors to quickly join the pan-Indian cause against the colony, but you have to remember, this is something that you need to understand. The Yamasee War ends because the English are able to convince the Cherokee Indian tribe to be their allies. So the only reason the Yamasee lost, remember, write this down, that the English turned to the Cherokee. And so basically, the Cherokee come up and they essentially just wipe out the Yamasee. And then obviously the English don't really uphold that very well later on, but it really goes to show that this was kind of everywhere, that that the natives understood that the English were not going to do right by them, no matter what they did. It was just a matter of time. And so it was one of those things where basically they were just taking advantage of the situation as soon as they could, to try and, establish something against the English. But unfortunately for them, it really didn't work that often. If there was going to be a colony, though, where peace with the natives could continue, it would be Pennsylvania, right? The colony's founding, William Penn, creates the Quaker religious imperative for peaceful relationships with the natives. He never doubted that the English would eventually take native lands, though, and he demanded that his colonists obtain native lands through purchase rather than violence. Although Pennsylvanians maintained relatively peaceful relationships with the Native Americans, the increased immigration and booming land speculation increased the demand for land. And so they turned to very coercive and fraudulent methods to negotiate getting this land from the natives, right? Yeah, we're going to buy it from them, but we're going to steal it from them, basically. We'll pay them, but, whatever. One of the glaring examples of this was the Walking Purchase of 1737, which is worth taking note of for quiz and test purposes. It was emblematic of both colonists' desire for cheap land and the relationship that was changing between Pennsylvania and their neighbors. Through the treaty, the native Delaware leaders agreed to sell Pennsylvania all of the land that a man could walk in a day and a half, which was a common measurement used by the Delaware to evaluate distances. So John and Thomas Penn, joined by the land speculator and longtime friend of the Penns, James Logan, hire a team of skilled runners to complete the walk on a prepared trail. The runners traveled from Wrightstown to present-day town of, which is the present-day town of Jim Thorpe, and the officials then drew the new boundary lines perpendicular to the running route, extend northeast to the Delaware River. The government basically measured out a tract much larger than the Delaware had originally intended to sell, which would have been roughly, 1,200 square miles. As a result, Delaware proprietary relations obviously suffer. And the Delaware left the land in question and migrated westward to join the Shawnee and other Delaware already living in Ohio Valley. They established diplomatic and trade relationship with the French, but the memories of this very suspect purchase endure and become a chief point of contention between the Pennsylvania government and the Delaware during the upcoming 7 Years' War, which we'll get to in our next chapter. And that brings us to a close of chapter 3. Thank you.